The door creaks. Just barely. A groan of hinges that no one in that studio audience will ever forget. For one suspended second, nothing happens. Then it swings open, and a man in a leather jacket leans into the frame like he owns the building, tilts his head, and says one word. Hello. The room detonates. Cameras shake. Grown actors standing 3 feet away are biting the insides of their cheeks so hard they'll ache tomorrow. And somewhere off to the side, 2 women who are supposed to be the stars of this show are fighting with everything they have not to laugh. That word, that single, ridiculous, perfectly timed word, will become one of the most instantly recognizable entrances in the history of American television. But almost nobody watching at home knew where it came from, or what it cost the people standing next to it to keep a straight face. This is a story Cindy Williams and Penny Marshall carried for decades before they finally let out loud. How 2 men who weren't even auditioning walked into a living room, became characters on instinct, and nearly derailed a hit show simply by being too funny to control. Long before Lenny and Squiggy existed, before the leather jackets and the greased hair and the entrance that stopped scenes cold, there were just 2 guests at a party. Penny Marshall's house was the kind of place where people gathered without much occasion. Actors, writers, comics drifting in and out, drinks in hand. The evening unstructured. Her husband at the time, director Rob Reiner, kept the same open-door habit. On one particular night, 2 familiar faces showed up, David Lander and Michael McKean, performers Penny already respected from their work with a sketch and satire troupe that had built a devoted following through the 70s. Nobody asked them to perform. Nobody handed them a script. But somewhere in the middle of the noise and conversation, something shifted. Lander and McKean simply slid into different people. Exaggerated postures, strange nasal cadences, a rhythm between them that felt less like 2 men joking around and more like a machine that had been running for years. The transformation took seconds. The room came apart laughing. Cindy remembered the electricity of it, how the 2 of them fed off each other so naturally it barely looked like performance at all. Penny didn't need convincing. She'd spent years around funny people, but this was different. An instinct so sharp it didn't require a stage. The timing could not have been better. Laverne and Shirley was still finding its shape. A scrappy comedy about 2 friends trying to build independent lives in Milwaukee, and its producer, Penny's brother Gary Marshall, was searching for something the show didn't have yet. Not another emotional beat. Not another dreamer. He wanted disruption. So the next day, with no formal audition and barely any notice, Lander and McKean were called to the soundstage. And whatever had happened in that living room happened again, this time in front of cameras. Instant, chaotic, undeniable. What began as an unscripted party, bit was about to become architecture. The characters weren't even called Lenny and Squiggy at first. The second man's name, in early drafts, was Anthony, an Italian neighborhood guy paired with Lenny for what was meant to be a single throwaway appearance. But the writer's room already had a problem. Too many Italian characters running through the show's world, from Frank DeFazio to Carmine Ragusa. Anthony didn't fit anymore. So they scrapped him, and in his place, Andrew Squiggy Squigman was born, vaguely European, entirely undefined by nationality, defined instead by sound. The name itself did half the comedic work before he ever opened his mouth. That shift freed the characters completely. Once they weren't tied to any specific background, Lenny and Squiggy became something stranger and more universal. 2 men whose entire identity was built from posture, rhythm, and nonsense. Cindy would later say the new names alone were enough to make an audience brace for trouble the moment they were spoken. And Lenny's full name, Kosnowski, had been engineered for that same instant absurdity. A name Penny-like joke sounded like a warning about livestock in your kitchen. Gary Marshall understood exactly why it worked, because he thought about comedy the way an engineer thinks about load-bearing walls. Every sitcom, in his mind, needed contrast, someone striving upward, and someone even further down to throw the strivers into relief. Laverne and Shirley were the dreamers, funny and flawed, but fundamentally sympathetic. What the show needed beneath them was chaos with no ambition at all. Characters so gloriously unserious that the girls looked composed by comparison. That was the entire function of Lenny and Squiggy. Not depth, not arcs, just detonation on cue and then gone. Gary wanted them in and out before the audience could catch their breath. Enter, get the laugh, leave. It sounds simple. It is one of the hardest things to execute in comedy, and it became the show's secret weapon, which brings the story back to the door. Because the entrance itself, the creak, the pause, the hello, wasn't an accident that got lucky once and stuck. It was rehearsed to the half-second. Lander and McKean built a physical language between them. How far Squiggy leaned in, how long the silence held before Lenny's grin arrived, exactly when the word finally landed. Cindy described it as controlled chaos, something engineered to look like an accident. The pause before the line, she said, was the whole trick. It gave the audience just enough time to brace for what was coming, and that anticipation was worth more than the joke itself. Off camera, that same chemistry became dangerous for everyone else on set. Once the two of them locked into rhythm, there was no guarantee where a scene would go. They'd add a word, twist a line, drop in a sound effect nobody scripted. Never to sabotage the moment, but to chase the laugh in real time, reading the room like musicians reading each other on stage. Penny had a phrase for it, playing jazz with comedy. For Cindy and Penny, that improvisational wildness turned every scene with Lenny and Squiggy into a kind of tightrope walk. They were the emotional center of the show, two women whose friendship carried the actual story. And if they broke character laughing every time chaos walked through that door, the show would stop being believable. So they developed what amounted to armor. Don't make eye contact. Don't look directly at David's face or Michael's smirk, because one glance was enough to end the take. Penny used to warn Cindy before certain scenes. Don't look at them. Just don't. It wasn't jealousy. It was survival, and it was craft. Cindy put plainly years later, comedy has a rhythm, and if everyone in the scene is trying to steal it at once, the whole thing collapses. Someone has to stay still so the audience can see who's moving. That stillness, that discipline to let two supporting actors detonate a room without letting the show's actual heartbeat get drowned out, was its own kind of performance, one that almost never got credit, because it was invisible by design. And Gary Marshall, obsessive as he was about pacing, learned to let those unscripted moments breathe rather than cutting them short. He'd sit with a stopwatch, and when the laughter in the room hit exactly the right pitch, he'd signal to keep rolling. He knew lightning when it struck, and he knew better than to interrupt it. What none of them fully understood at the time was how much weight that friendship between Lander and McKean would eventually carry, and how the story of Lenny and Squiggy wouldn't end with the show's finale, but decades later, in a much quieter and far more painful scene. David Lander spent years of his life managing multiple sclerosis, largely in private, while his creative partnership with Michael McKean continued long after the leather jackets came off. McKean carried both careers forward in his own direction, a defining role in a legendary mockumentary, a much later run on prestige television, but he never stopped showing up for his old friend. The visits continued, the old rhythm between them, the same one that filled a studio audience with laughter decades earlier, apparently never fully disappeared. By all accounts, they could still make each other laugh the way they had backstage on Paramount's old soundstage, back when none of it had a name yet. When Lander passed away in 2020, McKean didn't reach for a joke. He called him a kind man, a funny man, and a friend of 51 years. It wasn't a punchline. It was the truest thing said about either of them in this entire story. Proof that whatever chemistry had sparked in a living room decades earlier had never been an act at all. It was real and it lasted. That's the part almost no one talking about, hello, and leather jackets ever mentions. The comedy was instructed, rehearsed, timed, engineered down to the half-second pause. But the friendship underneath, it wasn't constructed at all. It just was. Which is, in the end, why the door still creaks in reruns and clip compilations decades later, and why audiences still laugh at a joke they've already heard 100 times. Every mismatched, overconfident, self-assured duo that's barged into a sitcom scene since, through Friends, through Brooklyn Nine-Nine, through a dozen shows that never bother to credit the source, owes some of the two men who wandered into a party uninvited and simply became someone else for a laugh. Cindy Williams and Penny Marshall spent years protecting the story of Laverne and Shirley as if it were fragile, as if the emotional core of the show might shatter every time chaos walked through that door. It never did. It got stronger, because underneath the absurd names and the rehearsed entrances was something the audience could feel even if they couldn't name it. Two friends, on screen and off, who never stopped making each other laugh. That's the story behind the door. Not a secret, not a scandal. Just two men who found each other once by accident and never really let go.